When I was a junior in high school, I was hired by a deacon who was a member of our congregation to help with farm work on his little farm on Saturdays and a few weekday evenings. He was a chiropractor and didn't have time for most of the basic chores on the farm, so he hired me and one of the other teens in our youth group, and we would go as we had time, and we would do things like clean the barn and take care of the sheep and plow some of the fields and clear brush and just basic farm chores like that. One evening I was there alone cleaning the barn, and the ram of the flock somehow got out of his pen and out into the open pasture. That ram had a very impressive full curl horns, and he wasn't very friendly, so I was a little intimidated by him. But I had to get him back in the pen, and so I went out into the pasture and tried to herd him over to the gate, but he wasn't having any of that. And so I developed another plan of attack. I went into the barn and I got a bucket and scooped out some corn from the feed bin. And I went out into the pasture right in front of the lamb. And I sprinkled a few kernels down and he hungrily gobbled it up. So I backed up a few steps and sprinkled a little more down. And he followed me eating it. And I backed up several more steps and sprinkled some more. By this time, I think he was getting a little impatient with that feeding process. So he lowered his head and he slammed right into the bucket, knocking it out of my hands, and the corn was spread all over the ground, which made him very happy, and so he started feeding. So I thought, well, okay, that doesn't work. I've got to come up with another idea. I went back into the barn and I got a piece of baling twine, and I went out while he was eating the corn and I slipped a noose of it around his neck. I was going to pull him into the barn. I didn't slip it around his horns because I reasoned if he felt the tension of the noose tightening around his neck, then he'll submit and follow me in order to ease up and get some slack on the rope and be able to breathe. Well, it didn't quite work out as I had planned. I pulled and he resisted, and I pulled a little harder and he resisted more. And so then I turned around and I put my whole body and legs into it to try to pull him, and noose tightened up pretty tight around his neck, and he apparently didn't like that because he lowered his head again. I felt the rope grow slack as I was walking away from him, and just as I turned to see what was happening, he slammed right into my legs, knocking me down, knocking the rope out of my hands, and then he trotted back over to the corn and began eating again. Now I was angry. Desperate measures were needed. So I went back into the barn and I brought out the tractor. And I backed the tractor up to where he was feeding on the corn, and I tied the loose end of the baling twine around the drawbar of the tractor, jumped on the tractor, put it in gear, and I began to drag that ram across the ground. He fell over and was being dragged along, and he made this loud, pathetic, gagging sound. And I turned around to look, and his eyes were rolled back in his head. I was killing that ram, so I stopped the tractor and got off and loosened the noose from around his neck. And he just jumped right back up, kind of shook a little bit, and went right back to feeding on the corn. And he laughed at me in sheep language. Have you ever heard a sheep laugh? It goes something like this. At least that's what it sounded like to me. I hate sheep. Turns out the Bible tells us we are like them. We are like sheep. And using the analogy of sheep and the shepherd, King David of Israel's history taught us a lesson about sustaining faith. It comes from probably the most well-known chapter of the Bible, the 23rd Psalm. And in that psalm, David teaches us that faith takes away fear. We touched on this subject last week when we studied Job's great faith statement from Job 13, in which he said, "Though he slay me, still I will trust him." Job had a kind of a faith in which he trusted God with death. David describes a faith which sustains us through death. So we're going to explore that this morning. We're going to focus on just one verse primarily out of the 23rd Psalm, and it's verse 4. Let's look at it. "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. I have referred to this verse more in the last 10 years than I did in the previous 30 of my ministry. It seems like that verse means more to me personally since I become more acquainted with death, having done many more funerals and done a lot more grief counseling. And maybe it has something to do with the fact that as I age, I realize I'm drawing closer to that milestone type of event in my life. The poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote, "Age is opportunity no less than youth itself, though in another dress. And as the evening twilight fades away, the sky is filled with stars invisible by day." In other words, he's telling us that though age dims our vision, it makes some things more clear to us. And one of those things that we become more clear about as we age is death. I suspect that David was older when he wrote the 23rd Psalm. It doesn't sound like the musings of a young man. Maybe it was that he was at the end of his life. We know that David lived into his 80s. He suffered a prolonged illness before he died. Maybe it was in his later years, or maybe even his later months of life, that he wrote these words. Psychologist Dan Baker wrote a book entitled "What Happy People Know: How the Science of Happiness Can Change Your Life for Better." In preparation for that book, he interviewed thousands of people in the United States who had reached at least the age of 100. Here's what he wrote about them. "What these folks have in common is a general sense of optimism." I pause right there. I find that amazing, don't you? That at the age of 100 or more, that they would have this general sense of optimism, knowing that death was probably just days away. He went on to say that they also have an ability to deal well with loss. Maybe that's because their spiritual beliefs have eased their emotional burdens. Maybe, like David, they have learned that the Lord is their shepherd. David was old enough to have learned that through experience. He was old enough to have seen many ways in which God had comforted him by providing his presence, strengthened him by being there with him. And so at this point in his life, David was confident about death, even though its threat was imminent. He knew the truth of Isaiah 46:4, in which God promises, "Even to your old age and gray hairs, I am he who will sustain you. I have made you and I will carry you. I will sustain you and I will rescue you." In this psalm, David teaches us, first of all, that God guides us through death. And it is an ominous journey. He describes it as walking through the valley of the shadow of death. Some translations use the phrase, "the darkest valley," instead. He's not picturing some lush, verdant meadow that lies in between two beautiful mountain peaks, but instead a deep and dark and dangerous cavern shut off from the sunlight most of the day, filled with thick brush and dark shadows and dangerous beasts. Dark valleys can be unnerving. I once tracked a wounded deer into one at twilight. I had not been in that valley before. It was thick and shadowy. The deeper I went into that valley, the darker it became. And soon, because of the waning hours of sunlight, the twilight turned into darkness. It was pitch black in that deep valley. When you are in the woods in the dark, everything looks the same. It's very difficult to get your bearings. I walked back uphill, not sure whether I was walking in the same direction in which I had entered the woods, when my flashlight caught the gleam of a reflection in the distance. I wondered what it was. It startled me at first. I remembered immediately what the landowner had warned me, that a pack of coyotes was working the area. And in fact, a friend of his had field dressed a deer just some weeks before, and smelling the blood, the coyotes had been attracted. And he had literally had to shoot his way out of that pack. And I was a little nervous, to say the least. But the longer I looked, the more it became clear to me that that wasn't what it was. In fact, it turned out to be a reflective thumbtack placed in the tree. A previous landowner had marked a trail out of that dark valley. What a relief that was. I followed the reflective tacks from tree to tree until I finally emerged out of the woods and onto the familiar path that led me to my truck. I had a guide through that dark valley. David promised that we all do. One day we will descend into the dark valley of death, and it will be unnerving for us. But we can have confidence because we have a guide who will go with us, taking us through it. What a great promise David makes us, that God will guide us through death. Let's not misinterpret that phrase, the shadow of death. We might be tempted to think that this is a promise that if we have enough faith, God will deliver us from the reality of death. We will only see its shadow pass by, but it will not touch us. The biblical promise here is not that our faith will deliver us from death. This is not a promise of salvation from death. David fully expected God to guide us through death. In his final verse in Psalm 23, he describes living in the house of the Lord forever. We know we will only arrive in heaven by going through death. But to those of us who have a relationship with the Good Shepherd, death is just a mere shadow. It has no power over us. We are touched by it and we must pass through it, but it will not harm us. It cannot hold us, and we need not be frightened by it. In my 45 years of ministry, I have often been called to the bedside of dying people. Most of those with whom I met in their final moments have had a solid faith in God and were at peace with dying. They knew the Lord as their shepherd. They were strengthened by this promise of God taking them through the unknown into the promised land. They had faith in a God who would take them through death. But there have been a few who did not have that quality of faith. What they really wanted was for God to deliver them from death. Theirs was not a faith in God as much as it was a desperate hope in God, like the hope that one might place in a religious amulet to protect them from harm. And when it became clear that God would not save them from death, they gave in to their fear. And those deaths are typically not peaceful or serene. This verse that we're studying today is my most frequently requested verse to read at funeral services. This psalm that we're studying from is almost always printed in funeral flyers. There's reason for that. It's because we need the reassurance of what this verse tells us. And it was intended to reassure us, to replace our fear with faith. David wrote, "I will fear no evil." Faith had replaced his fear. He testified this way in Psalm 34:4. "I sought the Lord and he answered me. He delivered me from all my fears." Let's leave that up for just a moment, please. When we have a strong enough faith, fear is diminished. How do we obtain that strong faith? David gives us a clue when he said, I sought the Lord. It's in seeking God that our faith grows. It's by spending time with him that we begin to grow in our faith. That's really the hidden teaching of Psalm 23. That idea of seeking the Lord and getting to know him and drawing close to him. It might not seem apparent to us at first glance or by quick reading through the 23rd Psalm, but there's a significant pronoun change as it refers to God that takes place in that psalm. In the first 3 verses, God is referred to in the third person singular when it says, he makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness. But by the time David got to writing verse 4, the pronoun changed from third person singular to second person singular. And so he said, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. It's an indication of a more personal knowledge of God. He isn't just some distant God in the third person that I know about. He is the God that I know. He knew God, and it gave him faith, and it took away his fear. He continued referring to God in the second person in verse 5 as well, when he said, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. He had confidence and was at peace because he knew God. And God offers that peace-giving faith to us. Seek him out. Spend time in his presence. And learn to trust him. There's a second lesson that we learn from this 23rd Psalm. And it is that we experience only the shadow of death. For Jesus took the substance of death upon himself. The substance of death is vaguely referred to in the previous psalm, Psalm 22, verse 1, in which it says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me? Now, stick with me through this. When Adam and Eve sinned, the judgment for their sin was death, but it was not the physical death that they suffered as a direct result of that act. They did, in fact, begin to die physically, but it's because they were separated from the tree of life. Its fruit sustained them for eternity as long as they ate it. Once they were no longer able to access the tree of life, then their bodies began to die. But it wasn't the act of sin that took their life directly. But what the act of sin did was to bring them to the point of spiritual death. They were separated from God by their sin and experienced spiritual death. They had to live outside of Eden, apart from God. The Jewish people understood that death is a separation, and we understand that too. In our physical death, the soul is separated from the body. Our life is separated from this world. Our presence is separated from our family and our friends. But there is a separation that takes place in spiritual death as well. When we sin, we begin to die spiritually, and we are separated from God. And living a life that's separated from God results in an eternity separated from God. Isaiah 59:2 tells us, it is your sins that have cut you off or separated you from God. In our sin, we are separated from God. We experience this spiritual death, so much so that there is a result of that. There is something to suffer for that. Romans 6:23 tells us that the wages of your sin is death. It isn't physical death that this verse is referring to, so that when we sin, God strikes us dead and we no longer exist in this world. That's not what happens. It isn't physical death, but it's spiritual death that is referred to. And when we live in spiritual death all of our lives, we will spend eternity in spiritual death, what the Bible calls the second death. In Revelation 20:14, the lake of fire is the second death. Jesus experienced separation from God on the cross, because he carried on his body the sins of the world, and he suffered for those sins on our behalf. And so he quoted that verse we read from Psalm 22:1, my God, why have you forsaken me? He experienced that separation, that spiritual death for the first time in his existence. And he quoted that verse as an indication that he had fulfilled the spiritual law, that sin leads to spiritual death. But he fulfilled it for us, so that now for us, only the powerless shadow of death remains. The terrible part of death is not dying and leaving this world. The terrible part of death is a separation from God. Physical death might appear frightening to us, but it cannot harm us. That's the reason David wrote, I will fear no evil. Death does not hold evil for us who know the great shepherd. The evil substance of death was suffered by Jesus. We are free from that now in a relationship of faith with him. And so death is not to be feared. It's not the end for us, but merely a transition to a much more beautiful life. Donald Barnhouse, the Presbyterian preacher of the mid-20th century, lost his wife while his children were young. As they were driving to the funeral service, a large truck pulled up beside them at a traffic light, casting its shadow over their car. He saw a teachable moment. He turned to his children and he asked them, would you rather be run over by that truck or by its shadow? The oldest responded, by its shadow. It can't hurt you. He then quoted our verse of study for this morning and explained that their mother had suffered only the shadow of death, and it had not hurt her. And that promise is made to us in this psalm. God calls you to be part of his flock, to follow him safely through the shadow of death and into the light of eternity, into a life of hope. And so we extend that invitation this morning. If you'd like to accept it and begin to follow the great shepherd and place your life securely in his hands, then he invites you to do that and offers his son to be your Savior for that relationship to take place. If you'd like to accept that, come as we stand and sing our invitation hymn.